Think about this. The transgender movement continues to put women at risk when staff at a women's shelter allow a transgender pedophile to stay there. In addition, feminists continue to double down on the war on men. The new feminist movement seems to be focused on fighting against men, when the biggest threat right now is how the transgender movement is reducing the value of women to a wig and a bodysuit. Finally, I tried to commission a survey to gather insight about the trans community, and it was canceled. My name is Chris, and this is the Think Report. Before I start, there are some controversial things that I'll uncover in this episode, and I feel like I need to start with a couple disclosures. First, I think it's wonderful that people can dress however they like, and it's accepted everywhere. It's incredible that we can express our personality in so many unique ways. I should also disclose that I'm a second-wave feminist, and everyone should be. I married the most wonderful woman who is smarter and more talented than me, and I wish more for her than myself. My favorite career mentor was also a woman. I have no political agenda here. I'm just looking for the truth. So let's get down to it. In my last video, I made a comment that in spite of all the gaslighting coming from the trans community, we all know that trans women are not real women. You can check that video by clicking the link in the upper left. We know this, but I wanted to know this for sure. I wanted to point at the numbers so that we aren't just confirming each other here. So I commissioned a survey. I contacted a survey company and went through the process of distributing a survey to the US general population. After setting up my survey, they contacted me and asked me to revise my question because they felt that it was a sensitive topic, which it is. Let's be fair, I get that. Here was my question. If a man transitions from a man to a woman, do they become a real woman? Possible answers were yes, no, and none of the above. In the company's message to me, these were the changes they asked me to make. 1. We would suggest to you to add a note in question 1 informing the respondents about the sensitivity of the topic. It could be along the lines of below. The following survey has questions on the topic of transgender. If you do not wish to take this survey, please exit the survey. So fine, I added that. 2. In question 1, include the answer option, prefer not to say. After making the changes, they emailed me again, saying that they have considered this survey to be politically sensitive, and hence we would be taking down the survey from the platform. So hold on. I went to their website, and this was their own mission statement, and I quote, "Our mission is to supply a continuous stream of accurate data and insight into what the world thinks, so that companies, governments, and institutions can better serve the people and communities that sustain them." So to summarize, the company that collects insight into what the world thinks is refusing to collect data on the things that actually matter. If we can't even collect data on important questions, how are we supposed to resolve conflict and serve our communities? The most important questions are going to be the controversial ones. We need data on this so that we can move forward, and it isn't just one side yelling at the other. These are the most important questions to be asking, and illustrates a complete failure of this company to fulfill its own mission statements. Asking what people believe about men transitioning to women is a really important question to ask. Our values create taboos, which inform laws, which are a feature of our country. If our values have changed, then that changes everything. That's why this question is so very important to ask. I'm not going to disclose the company I've been working with because that's not the point of this channel. I don't want any individual to feel put down or company to lose profit. I'm simply seeking the truth, which continues to evade us. I'll find an answer to this question. You may just need to subscribe to the channel and hang tight for a bit until I can get that data. I'll put it in a future episode. Moving on. Katie Dolatowski, a 22-year-old pedophile who was born male in the UK and charged with molesting girls, used a fake name to stay at a domestic violence women's shelter as a transgender woman. Katie tricked staff and was able to stay there with women and girls for 71 days. He was first charged in 2018 with assaulting a 10-year-old girl in a grocery store bathroom and filming another one. Obviously, this is very disturbing, but this isn't 100% a trans issue. This is first a criminal issue, and second, it's actually a broader cultural issue about how we safeguard women and children. Allow me to explain. The criminal component of this is clear. Someone who abuses children should never be around children. The fact that Katie abused 2 children only 4 years ago and is now on the loose, likely to reoffend, is pretty empty-headed on behalf of the court system. According to a study called Sex Offender Recidivism by Harris and Hansen, girl victim molesters have a 9% chance of getting caught and convicted with the same crime in the first 5 years after the first offense. That statistic is pretty high, and it doubles as the years go by. But at the same time, we know that people learn from their mistakes, and the likelihood of someone getting caught a second time is reduced if they've already been caught once. Thus, the recidivism statistic is low because the arrest rate is low. Less than 10% of pedophiles are ever arrested in their lifetime. Their chance of being caught twice is statistically very low. Pedophilia defenders point to the low recidivism rate, which is just second conviction rate, as evidence of low risk. It's a statistical trick, though, because conviction rate of a second offense is a poor measure of recidivism. Okay, so this guy shouldn't be out. That's clear. But here's the second issue. This guy was able to disguise himself as a trans person to gain access to potential victims. This isn't a new concept. Homer documented it almost 3,000 years ago with the concept of the Trojan horse, and he most certainly didn't invent it either. When the trans movement started to gain steam 10 years ago, feminists and many reasonable people voiced these concerns. What washrooms and change rooms do they use? Should they be allowed into female organizations like Girl Scouts? But since then, these real issues have been rebranded as trans rights. This is an important change because rebranding concerns from what washrooms trans people should use to trans rights takes the trans side of this debate and takes it from a defensive position to an offensive one, meaning that activists can now point the finger at reasonable people and claim that they don't believe in trans rights, which is of course not true. All we want to do is ensure the protection of children and women. But this communication pivot does put all of us on our back foot because no one wants to be labeled as oppressive over someone else's rights. These are real concerns. Back in September, a similar thing happened in the Canadian Halton School Board. A shop teacher started coming to school dressed in massive prosthetic breasts, see-through tops, and a wig. The crazy thing is that in spite of parental protests outside the high school, the Halton School Board still stands by this teacher. I mean, look at this guy. This is not a transition. That is not someone who is transitioning from a man to a woman. That's a guy who wants to dress in a way which is intentionally inappropriate in front of children. There's no way to interpret that differently. This is what I mean. Most transgender people are not predators, just like most men are not predators. But packaging concerns about change rooms into the ideology of trans rights fails to address the massive risk that we're dumping at the doorstep of women and girls. And where are the feminist organizations in all of this? Many of them support it. Miss Magazine, which is a US-based feminist publication, has a yearly list of the top feminists. Multiple women were added to this list simply for being trans. This whole thing strikes me as bizarre. New feminists aim to break the patriarchy and reinforce equality between men and women, often citing things like the gender pay gap and tearing down stereotypes. But trans people fight for the exact opposite. They want stereotypes. They want the heels, the long styled hair, and the big boobs. These are two groups that couldn't be fighting for more opposite goals. But yet, feminist groups continue to celebrate trans victories. At the bottom of the Miss Magazine list, they also had this section called In Memorandum, where they commemorate the victims of trans violence. In 2021, they claim that 50 trans people died as a result of trans violence, which is very sad, and no one should be a victim of violence for any reason. The solution Miss Magazine proposes is to shore up trans rights, which is ironic, since the current iteration of trans rights makes the world less safe for women, as I was saying earlier. They're trading the safety of women for the safety of trans. Safety for everyone is the overarching goal here, but Miss Magazine has a very specific goal to make lives better for women. So as you can see, their tactics seem very counterintuitive. This brings me to my last point, which is that the feminist movement seems to have pivoted off of its original path. The feminist movement should be focused on bettering women, but instead it's focused on tearing down men. Listen, I fully support second wave feminists. In this way, we should all be feminists. To even remotely imply that women don't deserve everything that men have is almost criminal. However, that's not the new wave of feminism. New wave feminism is about tearing down men. Last week, Julie Bindel, a UK feminist, doubled down on her attack on men. Take a look.
I always thought that feminists used to believe in equality and having, you know, women were discriminated against, they wanted to be equal. Now what I see is that women want equality, but only when it suits. They want the advantages where they have an advantage, like the criminal justice system where they're treated less harshly than men. But they want equality, but only when it suits. Is that a fair analysis?
No, that's not feminism. And I mean, too much equality, which is what I hear from men and anti-feminists all the time, is an oxymoron. But what actual feminists are fighting for is liberation, not equality, because we don't want to be equal to men in order to be able to exploit women in brothels, puke up in the streets on a Friday night, go back and bash our partners. We actually want liberation from the structures that oppress us, which means that we've got to tackle head-on male violence and the threat of male violence. And this is something that unites women all over the world. And the feminism I'm involved in, look, we're a movement, we're not a cult. We allow for differences of opinion. But we also are a social movement that has the right to define what we are. We have to have a set of aims and objectives. You can't have Margaret Thatcher and Beyonce demanding to be referred to as feminists when actually they're anything but. So feminism for me means that we have to tackle the thing that affects women globally, which is male violence. And because we don't believe that babies, boy babies, are born programmed to harm women, we therefore are very optimistic. In fact, feminists are men's best friends, because what we say is, you know, this is not necessary.
Where does Julie live? Where in the UK do men go to brothels, puke on the streets, then go home to beat their women? She talks about liberation from the structures that oppress women. What structure? What structure optimizes for men to puke on streets, then beat women? None. In fact, quite the opposite is true. If you puke on the streets, you'll be charged. If you go beat your partner, you'll be arrested. There are most certainly structures in place to prevent this. Those are called crimes. And thankfully, the volume of domestic crimes has been steadily decreasing. The problem with Julie's argument is that it's not men who are beating women, it's criminals, which might be mostly men, but are also women. But by making the problem about men instead of criminals, it's a little dishonest. And you're not going to convince anyone, especially men, if you're being dishonest about men. Feminist Camille Paglia is a brilliant trans feminist. If you don't know who she is, check her out. She'll blow your mind. She explains this very well.
What does that mean, free women, free men? What are you arguing for?
What I'm saying is that each sex has the right to define itself, all right? And we're in a period now where men are the targets of far too much blaming. I want to get the male bashing out of feminism. And I want women to acknowledge that men have a right to determine their own identities too. What's happened today is upper middle class career women want to redefine men, okay, into what operates smoothly in their own now now quite affluent career system.
So women are too fixated on careers?
I'm saying that life is dual, okay, and that in the Anglo-American world, okay, there has been a shift toward looking at your job as a definer of your identity. Once there was the world of women and the world of men. That is not our world right now. But I'm saying, women, stop blaming men for your feeling of unhappiness. Okay, what's happened is you've lost that old era, okay, where there was elder care and infant care and cooking and doing the laundry. Everything was together. Women were together for tens of thousands of years. Right?
So you want women to go back to doing the laundry?
Absolutely not. I'm saying stop blaming men. I'm saying stop blaming men, okay, for your unhappiness.
Look, the goal of feminism is to improve the lives of women, but you can't accomplish this by bringing down men. Battered women's syndrome is a real thing, but we aren't going to fix battered women's syndrome by ripping on men. That's not how that works. We address this by creating support systems that pull women, and in some cases men, out of those toxic situations and continue to prosecute these criminals. Let's flip back to Julie Bindel.
Pick you up on something though, Julie, on about this. According to the government's own figures, in terms of levels of domestic abuse, the highest level of domestic abuse on women is from other women in lesbian relationships.
I'm afraid that's not true.
Well, it's the government official figures. It's
please,
double.
It's not.
Well, Julie, they're the official. They might not be convenient figures, but they are the official figures.
Please invite me back anytime, as soon as we've both had a look at these official figures, so I can unpick them for you. This is a myth that's going around.
It's not a myth. They are the official figures.
I'll tell you how we work out how domestic violence plays out. The bodies in the morgues. There's one woman killed every 3 days by a violent former or current ex-partner.
So you're just talking about murder? You're not talking about other forms of domestic violence?
I haven't finished. If you look at the figures in A&E, if you look at the fact that the health consequences for women of domestic violence in heterosexual relationships are huge. In fact, it's the biggest health crisis globally than cancer, than road accidents, than other serious conditions and illnesses.
Okay, so naturally when someone references such an alarming stat like that, we have to look it up. He says according to the government's own figures, but he doesn't reference the report or the department he pulled that from. I tried to find what he was referencing, but I couldn't find that. So instead, I took a look for similar information in the US and Canada. I must say I was pretty skeptical about the claim that in terms of domestic violence, the highest level of domestic abuse on women is from other women in lesbian relationships. However, much to my surprise, it appears true. What I found was from the U.S. Center of Disease Control, so the CDC. I'll put it in the link in the description if you want to read what I found. It states that the first set of national prevalence data on intimate partner violence, so IPV, sexual violence, SV, and stalking victimization by sexual orientation was released. The study found that lesbians and gay men reported intimate partner violence and sexual violence over their lifetimes at levels equal to or higher than those of heterosexuals. That is not what I thought that was going to say. It doesn't clarify whether that's absolute totals or just per capita. However, I think the most reasonable way to interpret this is per capita, meaning that it's not higher overall, but the ratio of violence within the individual groups is higher for non-heterosexual relationships. Reading on, to be specific, 43% of lesbian women and 61% of bisexual women have experienced rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime, as opposed to 35% of heterosexual women. That's a massive difference. There are 3 reasons that some commit violence against their partners. The first is that they are conditioned for it, meaning that their parents did it, so they themselves think the behavior is okay. The second is that they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And the third is that they have some sort of cognitive issue that prevents them from properly dealing with their issues and emotions, which instead present themselves in anger and violence. Why homosexual and bisexual relationships result in a higher per capita ratio of domestic violence is not immediately obvious to me. But what is obvious is that the problem of domestic violence on women is not specifically a problem with men. Look, data from different studies indicates a high prevalence of domestic violence against women in all societies. In Western countries, it's estimated that about 25% of women experience intimate partner violence over their lifetimes. However, the other part of this problem is that most domestic violence is not reported. Reported cases of domestic violence against women represent only a small portion of the problem when compared to the available data. This part of the problem is also known as the iceberg of domestic violence. Think about that.